Representative Dabney, would you like to make a motion to move House File 1065 before the committee to lay over for possible inclusion?
I so move, Madam Chair.
Very good. Representative Dabney, I understand you have an author's amendment. Would you like to move the A21 amendment before the committee to get the bill into the shape you'd like?
I so move, Madam Chair.
Representative Dabney, would you like to introduce your amendment or have Mr. Uni from the department introduce the A21?
Madam Chair, thank you. Mr. Uni could best briefly describe the amendment.
Very good. Mr. Uni, to the A21, please.
Madam Chair, committee members, Representative Dabney, my name is Adosh Uni. I am the Director of Government Relations for the Department of Education. Thanks for the opportunity to briefly describe the amendment to the bill. In the first portion, lines 1.2 to 1.11, this makes technical clarifications to language establishing the temporary library legislative advisory group. The clarifications include correcting the Association of Minnesota Counties name, removing an irrelevant reference to multi-type, multi-county funding, making it clear the advisory group may consider any information it deems relevant, and removing a representative from the U.S. Senate from the group whose purpose was unclear and participation improbable. In the second portion of the amendment, it just makes clear, so this is line 1.12 to 2.17, it adds specificity to the Pelsby appropriation to clarify that of the total appropriation, $1 million per year is for the Collaborative Urban and Greater Minnesota Educators of Color grants, and approximately $750,000 per year is for mentoring, induction, and retention incentive programs for teachers of color. The overall appropriation remains unchanged. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. Members, any questions to the A21? Hearing none, all of those in favor of adopting the A21, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion prevails and the amendment is adopted. Representative Dabney, you may proceed with introducing House File 1065 as amended.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and members, thank you for the approval of the A21 amendment. Members, you'll recall the hearing earlier this month where we reviewed Governor Walz's budget proposal. This bill is that budget proposal in bill form, so you will recognize much of what's there. This has been a difficult and challenging year for Minnesota students, families, and educators. And we have a greater responsibility even than usual to respond with the resources that those students and educators need to better meet the needs of those children and families. It's a moral responsibility of ours. We also have a responsibility, of course, to be smart and strategic about those investments. The measures and steps that we can take now can really help students bounce back more quickly post-pandemic. So the House File 1065 emphasizes a couple of very important opportunities that we can provide to students through their schools. Expanded summer learning. We know that many students have been challenged learning in either distance or hybrid modalities, getting them back as best we can, as safely as we can, into summer programming will be a great opportunity for them to get the education that they've been hungering for. The little ones, preschool for 4- and 5-year-olds, is important to make sure that they are as prepared as they can be to hit kindergarten and make things happen there. But we also know that many students have been challenged with mental health concerns during the pandemic. The isolation too many have experienced has been hard on them. So House File 1065 provides additional resources for mental health care to make sure that students are well and whole as they approach the new school year. Also, one of the significant gaps we know exists between lower income students and middle class and wealthier students is opportunities to get out in the community, particularly after the pandemic has kept us behind closed doors, and see and experience and touch and feel. So House File 1065 envisions a $10 million supplemental funding for field trips, for getting kids out of doors and out of their homes and into museums and parks and places for activities, opening up their worlds. Lastly, we recognize through House File 1065 that financial stability for our schools is critical. We need to make sure that the programs that were there last year when the doors closed and things went to distance learning, those programs are going to be there again as schools safely reopen. And that those school staff are there because they're the ones who make the magic happen. So House File 1065 includes pandemic learning loss, pandemic enrollment loss support for schools so that they can maintain those programs and those staff. Madam Chair, with me today is Deputy Commissioner Mueller. She'll walk through the presentation of the Due North Budget Plan, and then Mr. Rooney and Ms. Yetter will walk us through the bill. So if you could recognize Deputy Commissioner Mueller at this time.
Very good. Thank you, Representative Davney. Good morning and welcome to the committee. Deputy Commissioner Mueller, please identify yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you very much. My name is Heather Mueller. I'm a Deputy Commissioner with the Department of Education, and we really appreciate your willingness to hear our budget bill. I'll be walking through a quick overview of our budget recommendations, and then our Government Relations Director, Adosh Uni, and our Finance Director, Terry Getter, will be walking through the specific language with the committee. As we think about education in general, one of the pieces that we always start with at the Department of Education are our commitments to equity. And the most important thing is that we continue to center our students in every single decision that we make. And as we talk about the budget, the one thing that we know most is that where we put our money is a reflection of what we value. And we want to make sure that as we are talking about this, we are clearly articulating what this budget reflects, and it consistently centers our students. When we talk about the governor's education and Lieutenant Governor's education plan, we know that we have a bold vision for our future where every child thrives. And Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan's Due North education policy is really focused on making Minnesota the best place for children to grow up, and our schools play a critical role in reaching those goals. Now, Minnesota faces large gaps and obstacles in education, and it's going to take our bold goals as well as strong collaboration across our communications to tackle our challenges both in education, and we need to close our gaps in the educational system requires us to improve the entire system in a way that removes inequitable practices and brings in supports where children need them. A world-class education requires that a student-centered approach that removes structural barriers, provides the very best teacher workforce, and reflects the students in our classrooms and creates safe and welcoming environments in every school in Minnesota. So both our budget and our policy bills are student-centered. They're anchored in equity, diversity, and inclusion. They strive to remove the barriers to student success, eliminate systemic racism, promote anti-bias practices through school communities, expand our opportunities, and enhance family and caregiver and guardian engagement. We believe that educational access and our equity and opportunities are the foundational principles upon which education must be built. And we celebrate many successes for our students, and we also face some of the largest gaps in opportunity and achievement for our Black students, our students of color, our Indigenous students, and for students who also receive special education services. Across Minnesota, students cannot access or participate in opportunities because of where they live, because of the color of their skin, because of their abilities, because of their zip codes, or because of their property wealth in their community. Our students deserve our best, and they must be engaged in an educational experience that honors their individuality and ensures that they have life options once they graduate. So this is why our budget and our policies consistently reflect our dedication to partnering with students, families, educators, and schools as we ensure access, participation, and representation for every student in their school setting. As we think about funding a 21st century education, we also need to consider what it looks like. We can go ahead and move forward, please. Thank you. What it looks like in making sure that we are meeting the needs of our students. And so first, we're going to talk about making sure that we are increasing the general education formula, 1% and 2.5% of the general education formula. Our current per pupil funding is roughly $6,567, and an increase to $6,633 in fiscal year 22 and $6,799 in fiscal year 23 gives an opportunity to really increase our support. It links to compensatory, sparsity, transportation, sparsity, ECFE, non-public and non-public transportation, as well as shared time. As we think about improving our equalization, we also need to consider what that means for our school districts across the state of Minnesota. And improved equalization is needed as equalization levels erode over time and as they've been outpaced by our growing tax bases or increases in property values. And so having the opportunity to tier this process and really look at not only the local optional revenue is being equalized, but also thinking about how it is we support those operating referendum and being equalized as well. As we think about our special education cross-subsidy, it's really important that we are cognizant of the fact that we need to hold a special education cross-subsidy at a hold harmless or at a hold that line per student. And so that means that our subsidy continues to grow. Between fiscal year 2009 and fiscal year 2019, our state special education aid per student increased from $1,149 to $1,815, and the cross subsidy per student increased from $648 to $808. The cross subsidy is the unfunded cost of special education for our students who also receive special education services, which school districts and charter schools need to cover using unrestricted general education resources. As the cross subsidy continues to grow, school districts and charter schools have fewer resources available in their general education fund to maintain quality education programs and to improve the achievement of all of our students. As we think about the cross subsidy for our students who are also receiving English language services, we know that this has increased from 6.3% of the total enrollment to 8.3% of our total enrollment. The current EL funding covers about 1/3 of our total EL costs, and the cross subsidy is estimated at $123.5 million for fiscal year 2023. And that's about 2/3 of the cost of funding EL services. And so we need to ensure that as we are thinking about making consistently holding and supporting our special education cross subsidy and meeting the needs of students who are receiving special education services, we also need to be doing that same thing for our students who are receiving English language services as well. When we think about looking at building a world-class education, when we think about that, that means that in this particular instance, we're talking about maintaining voluntary pre-K seats, Indigenous education for all, and ethnic studies are being added to our standards as well as our curriculum. When we talk about VPK seats for fiscal year 2021, the statewide cap on participation in the VPK and School Readiness Plus programs was roughly 7,160, which enabled 10.9% of our 4-year-olds to participate. Now the cap is set to eliminate 4,000 current seats, thereby reducing the program to 3,160 participants, or about 4.8% of our eligible 4-year-olds for fiscal year 2022 and later. It's important to note that during the fiscal year 20 and 21 application cycles, unfunded requests averaged 6,000, making the seat demand for these programs over 13,000 statewide. In the area of ethnic studies, we are looking to ensure that ethnic studies are embedded into our academic standards to promote racial equity, reduce implicit bias, and encourage curricula that recognizes the complex history and contributions of communities of color and Indigenous communities and the impact of racism in the United States. According to the National Conference for our State Legislators, Washington, Nevada, Illinois, California, and Maine have already embedded ethnic studies into their standards. When thinking about education, Indigenous education for all, every Minnesotan, whether Indigenous or not, should be encouraged to learn about the distinct and the unique heritage of American Indians in a culturally responsive manner. Every Minnesota student has the opportunity then to learn about tribal history, culture, treaty rights, contemporary tribal and state government institutions and relations, and the contributions of our American Indian tribal nations and urban Indian and Indigenous communities across the state of Minnesota. And so this gives us the opportunity to support the funding of tribally endorsed, historically accurate, culturally embedded curricular resources, and supports a partnership with our tribal nations and Indigenous education communities. In looking at supporting our moving forward with looking at a safe and nurturing and welcoming environment, we know that that means we need to look at our student support personnel, providing multi-tiered systems of support grants, and developing and supporting the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Center in our trauma-informed instructional practices. Specifically talking about our student support personnel, in fiscal year 2017, Minnesota had just one school counselor for every 659 students. Minnesota's student to counselor ratio was 45% over the national average of 455 students per counselor, and only 4 states has a higher student to counselor ratio than the state of Minnesota. This will give us the opportunity to not only expand access to counselor services, it also gives us the opportunity, based on local discretion and decision, to identify if they need a counselor, a social worker, a school psychologist, a school nurse, or a chemical dependency counselor. And it really helps to build the support around our students to ensure that they can continue to have the model that they need and reduce the ratios that we have across the state of Minnesota. In a multi-tiered system of support, the way that we think about that is not only in the lane of academics, but is also around behavior and social emotional learning. It's a triangle that you essentially cut right down the middle. And so we are looking at expanding grants to districts and charters to implement the framework to deliver those academic, social, emotional, and physical health services to students based in individual tiers of 1, 2, and 3. It also gives us the opportunity to expand the capacity to support the implementation of a multi-tiered system of support. Now, some of the pieces that you might have heard about that have been research-based and demonstrated incredibly promising results are language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling, like our letters, building assets are reducing risks, like BAR, positive behavior interventions and supports, like a PBIS model, as well as the early childhood pyramid. In order to be able to do this work and continue to be able to expand the support of multi-tiered systems of support, then we know that we also need to increase some of the work we have within our regional centers of excellence. So this would give us the opportunity to expand positions within the regional centers of excellence and have a position at the Department of Education that works across divisions to support multi-tiered systems of support, because every single division within the Department of Education has an impact not only on students and staff, but also really helps to reinforce not only the academic, but the social, emotional, physical, and mental health and well-being of our students. Finally, in this particular area, looking at ensuring that we are supporting trauma-informed grants, which is roughly a $4 million one-time appropriation, which gives us the opportunity to build a professional development model, build resources to be able to help to support districts across the state and charter schools across the state, and ensure that as we are working and partnering with students, as we are moving forward from this pandemic, that we have the ability to be able to support our staff and their ability to help to be able to support our students. And so this is another really important component that we're going to be able to provide for our students in a safe and nurturing environment. As we consider looking at making sure that we also have a caring and qualified educators across the state, we know that we need a statewide teacher mentoring program, we need to have educator career pathways, and we need grow your own expansions. When we're talking about teacher mentorship, we know that in the very first 3 to 5 years of an educator's professional life, that those years are incredibly important to be able to support. And when there are teachers who choose to leave the profession, it tends to be in those first 3 to 5 years. We also know that we have districts across the state who do not have the funding capacity nor the human capacity to be able to implement a mentor program to be able to help to support staff who are new in their work. And so this gives us the opportunity to build a model that supports districts who do not have a mentor model to be able to support people who are new to the profession. And also it gives us the opportunity to differentiate that support, not only in what we are doing for every single new teacher who are supporting through this new teacher mentor model, but also gives us the opportunity to differentiate based on individual needs, looking at our teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in partnership with some of the work of our TOCATE partnerships. In looking at Grow Your Own, we know that we have a number of educators who are in our schools now who need to be able to have support in going back to school to get their get their teacher license and to be able to be an educator. And so this gives us a new pathway to be able to provide tuition scholarships or stipends for eligible Tier 2 licensed teachers, education assistants, culturally liaisons, or non-licensed employees who are are of color or American Indian and are enrolled in an undergraduate or graduate level course that's part of a board-approved teacher preparation program leading to a Tier 3 license. So this would be another aspect that we would be adding to our Grow Your Own. Also, we recognize that in addition to needing to diversify the educator workforce, and the diversification of that educator workforce is incredibly important because we know it is not only good for our students, our Black students, our students of color, and our Indigenous students, but it is also very good for our white students. And so that is one aspect that we need to be able to grow. The other piece is that we need to be able to consistently grow our education profession in general. As an education system, we have built a number of different pathways into the pillars of that support our economy. And we also know that we are losing interest in people who are choosing to go into the education profession. And this is one of the best professions, right? Speaking as an educator, this is one of the best professions in the world. And we need our students to know that their access and ability to be an educator can begin in your high school years. And so building the pathway just for education in general, and then also looking at the Grow Your Own components to ensure that we are also expanding our Black teachers, our teachers of color, and our Indigenous teachers. Looking forward, at that expanding access, specifically at opportunities, gives us the opportunity to think through specifically full service community schools, expanding rigorous courseworks for our BIPOC students, the use of our MDE Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Center and anti-bias training, our non-exclusionary discipline professional development, and American Indian education. When we're looking at the full service community schools, we know that schools are established to meet the needs of students and communities they serve, and they provide those wraparound services. It is a research and evidence-based practice that has been able to support students not only in their academic success, but also in their social, emotional, mental health, physical, and helps to support not only them, but their families. And so this gives us the opportunity to fully engage in those high quality learning opportunities and wrap our services around our students and their families. Expanding rigorous coursework for our BIPOC students, as well as not only looking at that by a demographic perspective, but also by a geographic perspective. We know that there are more than 1,000 secondary CTE programs across 342 school districts that prepare more than 180,000 students each year for careers and opportunities in Minnesota's major workforce industries. And we know that we have a disparity in those percentages of students in poverty, students of color, students who receive special education services, and students who receive English language services who are participating in these programs. Not only is that the barrier as we look at CTE coursework, but we also know that that barrier exists in our AP classes, in our concurrent enrollment classes, in IB, and in PSEO. And so ensuring that we are expanding these opportunities for our diverse student populations so that they access participation and representation of our students, student population is reflected in these courses, and that also geographically our students have the opportunity to participate in these courses as well. Looking at continuing to think about non-exclusionary discipline policies. One of the things we talked about yesterday in our policy proposal and recommendations was the need to have non-exclusionary discipline. One thing that was identified within that is that in that work, it is incredibly difficult work, and we need to be able to provide the professional development and support around that. And that is what this is for. We know that moving forward with a non-exclusionary discipline policy means that we need to do our work differently. We do have 40 districts across the state who have done this work in partnership with the Department of Education and the Department of Human Rights. And this gives us the opportunity to build off of what our districts learned in those in their work and provide the professional development and support around that. So there are a vast achievement and opportunity gaps between our Black students, our students of color, and our students who also receive special education services compared to students who do not receive special education services. There are white peers, Hispanic peers, as ensuring that we are excluded from the classroom. And we know that our Black students, Hispanic students, and students receiving special education services are excluded from the classroom at a vastly disproportionate rate. And this proposal aims to reduce some of those disparities of more than 100,000 or more days of schools that students are missing and being kept out of classrooms. And this gives us the opportunity, one, to not only target and focus specifically in on those discipline policies and identify those gaps, but it also helps to reduce the achievement gap because we are not losing instructional time. Looking forward at the Department of Education's consistently supporting the professional development, similar to the way that we're doing that with trauma-informed instruction, it would be focused on anti-bias professional development, meaning that we have the opportunity to have professional development for grantees. It will be a train the trainer model. They would have support around that. It would be the development of those resources and then the support of those resources as they are utilized in our school districts that are participating in this grant. In our next piece, we want to talk specifically around American Indian education. In this tribal package, what we're really thinking about is the early learning package, which helps tribal nations work with their families in greater Minnesota. It gives grants to the 11 tribal nations to increase family engagement and education, increase language and literacy outcomes through language revitalization, enhanced teaching practices, and efforts to support teacher diversity. It also expands the tribal Head Start set aside. It designates roughly 10.72% of the total Head Start annual allocation to tribal Head Start programs that are, it's a proposed change in addition to the statute in the allocation process, which will provide more consistent funding from year to year. And it also stabilizes the program operations for our tribal Head Start programs. In looking at being able to look at the joint powers, we know that many Minnesota American Indian students attend schools in districts that are formed under the Joint Powers Act. And it means that many of our times in Greater Minnesota, the Joint Powers Act provides authority for school districts to offer services to students cooperatively, and often creates another district that is really thinking through how it is that they would be able to support and less likely to utilize those American Indian education programs. As we look at clarifying the recipients of American Indian education aid, the way that the statute currently reads, has led to a lot of misunderstanding with school districts as to who this aid can be spent on. And so this change is going to provide that American Indian education aid may only be used for Native students to participate in American Indian educational programming after all American Indian students have specific cultural and academic needs are met. And so first and foremost, it is meant to be spent on our American Indian students. Also looking at data analytics, we know that this gives us the opportunity to fund some additional positions in the data analytics unit to support the Office of American Indian Education as we are looking to monitor progress and access gaps in achievement as well as opportunity, and supports policy and developmental proposals. In looking at Indigenous education for all, MDE must include the contributions of the American Indian tribes and communities as it relates to our academic standards. And during the review and revision of these required academic standards, it gives us the opportunity to consult with a statutorily provided list of stakeholders. And while we as a Department of Education have a practice of consulting with our Tribal Nation Education Committee and tribal nations specifically on academic standards, current law does not require that we do that collaboration with our TNEC partners, and this would give us the opportunity to have that written into statute. Also looking at the MITTP program, currently the scholarship recipients may only use their funds to cover expenses that are greater than the federally determined expected family contributions. And we know that many students and families do not have the expected family contributions, which is determined based on family income. And so this will give them the opportunity to use their funds as they need. And finally, it's looking specifically at tribal nations relations training. We know the work and partnership that we have between our Minnesota government and our tribal nations governments, and the recognition of that partnership and the history and the work that we need to be able to do to not only support our government to government relationships, but also to ensure that we are able to support our American Indian students with a solid understanding of where we are and how we can continue to partner with our tribal governments. And then looking at expanding language access for families. We know that if any point in time we have known that we have struggled with being able to consistently communicate to all of our communities, right? And ensuring that beyond printing any type of translated or having any materials specifically in English, we also need to have translated materials. We know that we have school communities across the state of Minnesota who do not have the funding or the human capacity to be able to do that. So this would be able to help to provide services to be able to support that work for school districts who need that support, as well as ensures that we are creating a way for us to have those translated materials coming specifically out of the Department of Education and support our public engagement with our families. In looking at EdFi and modernizing our data submissions, we know that in our leadership, we need that we have put forward technology that was initiated under the implementation of the 2016 All Kids Count Act, which required the department to report graduation rates, the results of the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessments, as well as having additional information detailed by the ethnicities for students of color and American Indian students. And the implementation of EdFi has been funded thus far through a federal grant, which ended on December 31st of 2021. Without the increased funding, progress is going to be paused in the implementation of the EdFi system overall, as well as the implementation of the All Kids Count Act will essentially pause, and the efficiencies and advantages of EdFi will not be realized. And so this funding would give us the opportunity to ensure that it is fully funded over a 10-year period. And finally, looking at any reductions that we may need to be thinking about as a department and thinking about statewide is we know that we need to be thinking about the way that we are funding our MCAs. And so prior to the MCA for implementation in fiscal 22 and fiscal year 23, we can utilize a greater percentage of federal funds to pay for a statewide assessment contracts. And so this can only be accomplished though for these 2 years. And so that is one place, as well as looking at our college entrance exams and reimbursement. And this program reimburses school districts and charter schools for the cost of one nationally recognized college entrance exam per student who wishes to take the exam and is identified as receiving free or reduced price lunch and is unable to pay. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Adosh Uni.
Thank you, Commissioner Mueller, and welcome back, Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, again, Adosh Uni, Director of Government Relations for the Department of Education. Appreciate the opportunity for the ability to walk through HF 1065. I'm just going to give a brief intro. We'll walk through the individual sections and the articles, and in the appropriations sections, we'll just highlight the items that have new funding or those two last cuts you saw. We won't talk about any of the items that are ongoing program funding. So with that, I will pass it over to Finance Director Terry Yetter for the beginning of our walkthrough.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. Ms. Yetter.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Terry Yetter. I'm the School Finance Director at the Department of Education. And I will start with Article 1, which is the General Education article. Sections 1, 4, 7, and 20 all pertain to the recommendations for the department to retain a portion of the district allocation for state-approved alternative learning programs to provide funding for administrative oversight and coordination of these programs. So Section 1 includes the administrative set-aside in the calculation of the reserve for area learning center programs. Section 2 makes students receiving early childhood special education services eligible for English learner revenue. This allows these students to generate EL revenue in the same manner as other early learning programs. Section 3, sections 3, 8, and 13 all deal with the English learner cross-subsidy recommendation. Section 3 increases the basic allowance for EL revenue per student from $704 to $755 beginning in FY23. The concentration formula per student is also increased from $250 per student to $536. For FY24 and later, it also links the allowances to the increases in the basic general education formula. Section 4 includes the state program, alternative program administration set aside into the calculation of the reserve for the graduation incentive programs. Section 5 simplifies and aligns the calculation of kindergarten pupil units by setting the minimum hours of instruction for kindergartners with a disability to be the same as with all other kindergarten students. Section 6 eliminates language in the compensatory revenue statute associated with the expiration of the voluntary kindergarten program, which starts in FY22. For Section 7, this includes the state-approved alternative program administrative set-aside into the calculation of the average general education revenue that's used for learning year pupil units. For Section 8, this increases the EL concentration factor from 11.5% to 16.8%, and this is associated with the concentration allowance increase from Section 3. Section 9 increases the general education formula allowance by 1% in FY22 and 2.5% in FY23. Section 10 links the extended time revenue allowance to the basic education formula allowance beginning in FY24. Section 11 for FY21 only increases the declining enrollment revenue from 28% of the general education formula allowance to 48.5%. And this language is also included in the governor's summer programming bill, House File 1064. The section also strikes language related to the voluntary pre-kindergarten seats that are set to expire. Then Section 12 simplifies the local optional revenue program by eliminating the current tiers beginning in FY23. It improves the equalization by calculating the levy share using an equalizing factor equal to the greater of $844,600 or 123% of the statewide referendum market value tax base per pupil. And it also increases the revenue for FY24 and later by the rate of growth in the general education formula allowance. Section 13 moves the English learner concentration formula from the basic skills revenue statute to the EL revenue statute in Section 3, and this is for FY22 and later. Section 14 makes technical changes and removes obsolete language in the compensatory revenue use statute. Section 15 requires at least 80% of compensatory revenue to be spent at the generating site, and this is up from the current law of 50%. Section 16 requires districts to provide details on the functional areas on which compensatory revenue is spent. Section 17 for FY23 and later simplifies the referendum revenue calculation by combining the two tiers of equalized revenue into a single tier. Section 18 for FY23 and later, the referendum equalization sets the equalizing factor for the single equalized tier as the greater of $554,300 or 85% of the state total referendum market value tax base per resident pupil unit. Section 19 for FY23 and later, referendum equalization aid equals the difference between the revenue and the levy. This removes a separate calculation for the two tiers. Section 20 transfers the 0.5% of the basic general education aid generated by students participating in state-approved alternative programs to the department to provide the administrative support and program oversight. Section 21 corrects a year reference used in the calculation of tax increment financing adjustments that are made to school districts, state aids, and levies. And then Section 22 is the FY21 general education aid appropriation change for the current year obligation of the one-time FY21 declining enrollment recommendation. It also makes the changes for the November forecast-based appropriation. And then Section 23 is the appropriation section for both the general education aid program and the other programs that are included in Article 1. This includes not only the base forecast appropriations for these programs, but also includes the recommended increases in general education aid for the formula allowance, the EL cross-subsidy, simplifying the referendum and LOR levies, the enrollment decline, and then the early childhood alignment for the EL funding. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mr. Uni.
Thank you, Ms. Yetter. Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, committee members, thank you again. Adosh Uni, Department of Education. I'll be covering Article 2 and Article 3 and then passing it back over to Ms. Yetter. Article 2, Education Excellence. The first section adds Indigenous education as a required instruction area for Minnesota schools. Section 2 adds to the academic standards requirement that all standards processes must have a focus on Indigenous people and people of color within and beyond the United States. Section 3 adds Indigenous education to the social studies standards and sets expectations for Indigenous education curricula. Section 4 requires the commissioner to engage in formal tribal consultation and consult with the Tribal Nations Education Committee as part of the academic standards review process. Section 5 adds Indigenous education standards to the revision review statute, requires that Indigenous education standards be consistent with recommendations from the Tribal Nations Education Committee, requires that ethnic studies must be included in the review and revision of all academic standards, and also changes the physical education review cycle from beginning in 22-23 school year to the 26-27 school year. Section 6 adds Indigenous education to the social studies credit graduation requirements. Section 7 requires school boards' long-term strategic plan to include identifying for their districts a list of K-12 materials that accurately reflect the diversity of Minnesota. Section 8 requires Indigenous education for all Minnesota public schools and requires the districts to provide evidence of required implementation strategies to MDE and establishes MDE requirements to assist and support schools in their implementation. Section 9 amends PSEO or post-secondary enrollment options eligibility to clarify that students who have completed course requirements for graduation may only participate in the PSEO program until either the end of the school year in which they begin the program or the school year in which the pupil's peers graduated, whichever is first. Section 10 establishes the online learning program fee administration account under the special revenue fund, and this appropriates money to MDE for administration costs from that revenue fund. Section 11 amends the list of parameters for students who participate in the graduation incentives program to focus on just those that are performing below academic levels or not on track to graduate. Performing below their peers or not on track to graduate. Section 12 amends the American Indian Education Statute to require that all American Indian students' needs and accountability factors are the same or exceed their non-American Indian peers before including non-American Indian students in the American Indian education programs. Section 13 adds cooperative units to the American Indian Education Aid eligibility. Section 14 adds a statutory section for student support personnel aid to hire more student support personnel and support their professional development. And Section 15 is the appropriations section. I'll just be highlighting the changes. There's the reductions for statewide testing and reporting system and for the college entrance exam reimbursements. And then there's the investments for multi-tiered systems of support, student support personnel aid, student support personnel workforce development pipeline, as well as the support our health services personnel at their health services position at the department, funding for full service community schools, funding for Indigenous education for all, and funding for expanding rigorous coursework for Black, Indigenous, and students of color and in greater Minnesota. And that concludes Article 2. In Article 3 for teachers, Section 1 provides a technical clarification on the eligibility for the Minnesota Indian Teacher Training Program. Section 2 provides that all expenses in this program are eligible to be covered up to the cost of attendance for scholarship, including any expected family contribution. Section 3 establishes the Grow Your Own program in statute, formerly in session law, creates a third pathway for Grow Your Own, and extends the time frame over which funds can be used to 60 months. And Section 4 is the appropriations section. The new investments are in Grow Your Own grants, Educator Career Pathway grants, the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Anti-Bias Professional Development grants, the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Trauma Informed grants, Statewide Teacher Mentor Program, early childhood tribal education and engagement grants, tribal relations training for school leaders, and non-exclusionary discipline training grants. And that concludes Article 3. And with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Ms. Yetter, for Article 4.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. Ms. Yetter, as brief as possible.
Thank you. Terry Yetter with Department of Education again. Chapter 4 is the article on special education. Section 1 increases the special education cross-subsidy aid from the 6.43% to 9.33% for FY22, and then 12.11% for 23 and later. The Section 2 is the appropriation section. The increase in the cross-subsidy would be included in the special education aid appropriation. Then for Article 5 on facilities, Sections 1 through 3 of Article 5 relate to the proposal to simplify school levies and improve equalization for debt service equalization. Section 1 eliminates the separate tiers and equalizes all revenue over 15.74% of the adjusted net tax capacity at the same rate beginning in FY23. Conforms the language for capital loan districts into the single tier of equalized revenue. For these districts, debt equalization revenue remains as a portion of the levy in excess of the amount raised by the maximum effort tax rate. Then Section 2 provides that beginning in FY23, equalized debt service levy equals 100% of the initial equalizing factor, which is the statewide average adjusted net tax capacity per 3-year prior pupils. This is the same equalization rate as for the old second tier of equalization. Section 3 combines the debt service equalization aid into the single tier. Section 4 clarifies the reporting of safe schools expenditures to MDE to provide more detail by functional area. And then Section 5 makes appropriations to this article. The change item for debt equalization aid is included in the increase in the debt service equalization aid appropriation. And that concludes Article 5.
Thank you, Ms. Yetter. I'm sorry, did I hear?
Madam Chair, this is Mr. Uni.
Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, we really appreciate the latitude here. We only have a couple articles. I can get it probably completed in about 2 or 3.
We are over time, so as briefly as possible.
Sure.
Mr. Uni.
Madam Chair, Article 6 is nutrition and libraries. Section 1 does preschool or breakfast reimbursement for early childhood special education students. Section 2 establishes the library legislation advisory group. And Section 3 just has the appropriations, which covers the school breakfast aid. Article 7 is early childhood. Section 1 is the set aside for tribal Head Start appropriation. Section 2 is the 4,000 seats that are expiring for voluntary pre-K, making those ongoing. And Section 3 modifies the time frame that an early scholarship can be used, or that need to be selected. The provider needs to be selected from 10 months to 3 months. And the Section 4 includes the appropriations for ongoing funding. Article 8 is community education, and that Section 1 holds the ABE growth formula harmless for any changes. Section 2 is ongoing appropriations. There's no new funding there. And then the final article, Article 9, state agencies. Section 1 increases the teacher and administrator's licensing fee for PELSB and to charge applicants for using the online system. Section 2 cancels $2 million that was appropriated for legal costs relating to litigation in fiscal 20. And some funds for the general fund for agency operating costs for fiscal 21. And Section 23 is funding for the Department of Education. There we've got the additional funding for litigation in the future, data analytics, our EdFi program, voluntary pre-kindergarten program administration, translation services, and ethnic studies. Section 4 and 5 and 6 are for appropriations for the state academies, Perpich and Pelsey. With that, Madam Chair, concludes our walkthrough of HF 1065. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Uni. Members, it is my goal to have this bill laid over by 11:55 today. If there's any time at the end, we will take questions then. We have quite a few testifiers from the public that are prepared to testify. Up first, we have Ms. Mendoza, and on deck is Ms. McCoy. Ms. Mendoza, please state your name. Welcome to the committee and proceed with your testimony.
Good morning, I'm Becky Mendoza. I'm from St. Paul Public Schools and the Minnesota School Counselor Association.
Please proceed.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Becky Mendoza, and I'm joining you today as a school counselor with St. Paul Public Schools and as the chair of the Anti-Racism and Equity Committee for the Minnesota School Counselors Association. My purpose today is to state my support for the governor's budget bill recommendations regarding student support personnel, but also to give specific context as to why this is pressing for all Minnesota students. We know that Minnesota has some of the widest achievement data in the nation, that our white students have higher graduation rates, test scores, and lower disciplinary data than their BIPOC counterparts. This has resulted in targeting classroom teachers, starting hundreds of intervention programs, implementing more testing and data evaluation, and yet never addressed this systemic truth that not all of our students have access to the necessary supports to experience academic success, and that our school system is structured to advantage those who built it. We've been fortunate enough to see the pandemic magnify these concerns that many of us already knew existed. School support personnel like school counselors are in a unique position to provide the space, support, and advocacy for students whose voices get overshadowed. One example I can bring you is from the last few weeks. I spoke with a student of color who prior to distance learning was a straight A student, very bright, spunky, and incredibly capable. Their academic performance in distance learning has been the opposite, failing every class. We talked about how classes were going, why they felt that was happening, who could support them, if they felt comfortable talking to their teachers, and why this mattered to their future. We talked to their hopes and dreams and how all of these things were still possible. This was their final thought to me. Ms. Mendoza, I have no one else to talk to about this. You are the first person who asked me how I felt about my classes without judging me for failing the classes I know I can pass. Thank you for asking me and making me hopeful about finishing high school. This is one of many conversations I've had with my students, and I am in a school that has a team of 5 counselors. SPPS has prioritized counselors within their district. This is not the same of every metro school district and not of all the districts around the state. If you zoom out of the metro and into more rural areas of the state, counselors have higher ratios and less time to devote to their students amongst the many other duties they hold. Can you imagine how much more our students will succeed if they all have access to a support person who will always advocate for them, or having access to a school nurse when they're injured in PE class? Can you imagine the burden taken off of our teachers' plate when they're able to send a student to a counselor or a social worker when they are in crisis? These recommendations from the governor are one step in the right direction. We have so much more work to do, but I'm hopeful that this will kickstart the change our students desperately deserve. Thank you for our time and attention, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Mendoza. Up next is Ms. McCoy. On deck is Ms. Cole. Welcome to the committee. Please identify yourself and proceed.
Good morning. My name is Christy McCoy, and I'm the current president of the School Social Work Association of America, as well as the legislative chair for the Minnesota School Social Workers Association. And I've been practicing as a school social worker for 17 years in St. Paul schools.
Proceed.
Thank you. This past week, it has been reported that our nation has reached over 500,000 lives lost as a result of the coronavirus. More alarmingly is that within these numbers, the disproportionality of lost lives within our Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color is almost double the rate of white Americans. What this means is that these numbers represent the loss of loved ones for many of our students and families we serve. Thus, the trauma and grief associated with losing a loved one is only one of the many factors impacting our students' emotional and physical well-being today. Pre-COVID research showed that 1 in 4 children had been exposed to at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Today, every one of us has been impacted by the trauma of this pandemic in varying degrees, including our youngest learners. In addition to mourning losses, students are also navigating social isolation, food and housing insecurity, parental job loss, racialized trauma associated with the increased acts of violence in our communities of color, and dealing with school transitions. Thus, in order to effectively mitigate the detrimental effects of this public health health crisis, it requires a comprehensive, integrated approach to holistically address the mental health needs of our students. Exposure to traumatic events like the pandemic, especially during a child's early years, can adversely affect a child's sense of security, attention span, memory, and ability to process information. It can create inconsistent school attendance, as we have been seeing over this year, and can lead to poor outcomes later in adulthood. School social workers have witnessed firsthand how unresolved grief and loss, persistent anxiety and fears has overwhelmed the capacity of our students to cope, impacting their educational experience. I personally have observed increased suicidal ideation, feelings of hopelessness, and the effects of unrelenting anxiety on my students' ability to learn. On behalf of MISWA, I urge you to support House File 1065, which includes critical funding that student support services personnel within Minnesota schools to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. One of the elements of this legislation is not only funding the school-employed school personnel like school social workers, but creates a workforce development initiative to increase the number of school support personnel each year. The value of investing in school-employed personnel like school social workers is that we can respond to crises and needs in the moment because we are embedded in the school community. School social workers are uniquely trained to assess student needs, overall functioning, provide therapeutic and crisis management services, advocacy for our children, working with families and connecting with them with vital community services, and facilitating professional development for our school community on topics like stress and mental health. Research has proven that school social work interventions are effective in helping children and adolescents obtain the skills to problem solve, improve peer relations, and improve interpersonal functioning and increase academic achievement. Students can't learn if their mental health and basic needs are unmet. So investing now in our children is an investment in their healing and recovery. While the needs are great, school social workers stand ready and support our students in every way that we can.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Up next is Ms. Cole. On deck is Ms. Stately. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, Chair Daphne and members of the committee. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to testify in support of House File 1065. My name is Paula Cole, and I am the Executive Director of Educators for Excellence Minnesota, a teacher-led nonprofit with approximately 2,300 members across our state. Our members are united around a common vision of an excellent and equitable education system that offers all students the opportunity to succeed while also elevating the teaching profession. We are really excited that the governor's budget proposal aligns with our approach to make sure that we are making bold changes that are necessary on behalf of Minnesota students. We are really happy to support the following provisions in House File 1065, and there's a lot of them, but I chose to focus on only two. There's a priority to prioritize school resources for those who need it most, requiring 80% of compensatory revenue to be used at the school site. We encourage members to go further and require that compensatory revenue be used on evidence-based practices that demonstrate increased student achievement and eliminate the poverty cap, which harms schools with high numbers of students of living in poverty as measured by their eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. These provisions are included in Representative Fi's House File 1144. And I want to tell you a little bit, I like to always come here with a little bit of a personal story because I know you've spent quite a while, your work is very technical. And I am a former teacher. I'm also a parent of a 4-year-old. And I can tell you now that as she gets ready to enter kindergarten, she already knows how to read in 2 languages and count to 120, which are standards for first graders. Sadly, her peers, when they enter in September, are not going to be at the same level. And the reality is that I already know, I don't know who her teacher is going to be, but I already know that that teacher is going to be struggling to differentiate instruction for students at all levels. And this is why having the funding that we need to support interventionists, reading and math specialists, and also lower class sizes is very, very crucial to ensure that we can grab that gap from the very, very beginning. I also want to say that we are very grateful for your support of Grow Your Own programs in this bill. I hope to see it come through to ensure that we can increase teacher diversity in Minnesota, but also through mentorship so that those teachers of color are able to be successful and stay in the classroom. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. And I'm always happy to connect either one of you with a teacher who lives in your district to discuss anything related to education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cole. Up next is Ms. Stately on deck, and I apologize for the wrong name if I mispronounce. Ms. Wambeka, please state your name for the record and proceed.
Mr. Chair and committee members, I am Ramona Quito Stately, Director of We Are Still Here, Minnesota, a project of the Native Governance Center, a St. Paul-based nonprofit. I am also the president of the Minnesota Indian Education Association, an enrolled member of the Santee Sioux Nation, and educator, most recently in the Osseo Area School District for 15 years. I thank you for the opportunity to provide brief testimony in support of certain provisions in House File 1065. The We Are Still Here project, comprising Native American and non-Native volunteers from a wide spectrum of backgrounds, is working to make the public narrative about Native Americans and tribal nations more accurate and visible in education and pop culture. Among the many important Indian education and Native American related provisions in this bill and the governor's policy bill, there are two on which we especially encourage the committee's support. First, we urge your support of Indigenous education for all. Most school children are exposed to only a very limited and often inaccurate portrayal of Native-related subject matter. It is widely admitted in education circles that most educators feel unprepared to teach Native American topics and are self-conscious about the gaps in their knowledge. This proposal would give school districts and educators better tools for instructing both non-Native and Native students about the state's Indigenous peoples, their history and culture, the important contributions which Native Americans have made and are still making in the state, and the contemporary lived experience of Native communities. The second provision we commend to your attention is to tribal nations relation training for school leaders. Minnesota's 11 tribal nations are located throughout greater Minnesota. They enjoy mutually beneficial collaborations with other governmental bodies and private sector partners. And tribes are leading employers in their respective regions of the state to the advantage of their own communities and their neighbors. Nevertheless, the nature and role of tribal governments remain too little understood. This proposal would give school board members and administrators a structured introduction to and background knowledge about tribal governments, similar to the highly successful tribal relations training, which has been made available to state agency personnel. With the support of these two provisions, we believe that Minnesota's K-12 system can contribute to a more harmonious, respectful, and prosperous future for all of our children. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Up next is Ms. Wambeka. On deck is Mr. Ellis. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name and proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair and Finance Committee. My name is Jody Wambek, and I am with Wilmer Public Schools. I'm the Early Childhood Program Manager here, and I am here today to speak on behalf of House File 1065 and Voluntary Pre-Kindergarten. Wilmer has been a fortunate recipient of VPK funding since the inception with 113 slots. These slots have provided opportunities for many children to attend preschool that otherwise would not have had the opportunity, which also provides those students the opportunity to build a strong foundation for learning. We work closely with our cultural liaisons as our first connection to many of our families, especially those who feel their children are too young for school, are home with shift-worked parents, or utilize family friend, neighbor, or legally non-licensed care. Our liaisons have worked hard to bridge the gaps in our Somali and Latino communities to build relationships that continue from early childhood throughout the child's school career, as well as making connections to other services in the community. Over the past few years, our preschool programs have served families that qualify. 62% of our families have qualified for free and reduced lunch, and 57% of our families have been identified as EL. In Wilmer, our community is focused on working together to ensure our children are prepared for success in kindergarten. As the school-based early learning program, we work closely with providers in our community to support children and families. Wilmer has several parent-aware rated early childhood programs whether they're private preschools, childcare centers, or family childcare. What that means for us as the school-based program, we're very intentional in our outreach to families who enroll in VPK. All families can register. However, we prioritize students based on need. We also work very closely with our early childhood family ed program to provide parent support through our parent partner program that aligns a parent educator with families who need additional supports. And this year, in the year of COVID, we've also started a program called Parent Pointers, which are weekly parent ed videos that are on all of our preschool classrooms, Google Classroom for parents to view. And with the multiple learning plans we have been in throughout the year, we have seen gains with many of our children. However, we've seen the least amount of growth in social emotional development. We're working on addressing supporting students in our school-based programs such as VPK by collaborating with school staff to ensure our students achieve these skills. For us to offer the programming we do, we blend the multiple funding streams that we are fortunate enough to get. But when and if one of those funding streams is removed, the program has to readjust and would put the burden of the cost on the parents' shoulders, which many would be unable to afford the tuition, which would then widen the achievement gap. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. On deck right now, or up next is Mr. Ellis. Please state your name for the record. On deck is Ms. Christine Osorio. Welcome to the committee and proceed.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Committee members, Kevion Ellis from Education Minnesota, and on behalf of our 80,000 plus members from across the state, I would like to just touch on a few of the provisions in the bill today. So to begin with, we support full service community schools, which provide wraparound services to meet the needs of students and markedly improve graduation rates. We also support the investments in mental health, trauma-informed aid, and the expansion of student support personnel. We also support teacher mentoring grants because, as we all know, new teachers have had a suboptimal student teaching experience, to say the least. And we need to provide them with we need to provide them with more supports to retain and grow them. Regarding teachers of color, this is an area of the bill where we hope that the legislature can make a stronger investment. While we support the increase in Grow Your Own programs, the Coalition Increased Teachers of Color and American Indian Teachers supports $80 million in investments. This is based on the meeting the demand from prior grant proposals, so we know that there are people out there who would benefit from this. And with that, I would just like to thank the committee today and turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very, very much. Up next is Ms. Osorio. On deck is Mr. Avelar. Please state your name for the committee and proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Christine Tucci Osorio, and I am the superintendent for School District 622, which is North St. Paul, Maplewood, Oakdale, and parts of several other communities. I'm here to speak today just to advocate for a reduction in the cross subsidies for EL and special education funding. As you know, cross subsidies are the portion of the expenses that we face that we have to pay out of different funds because we don't get enough reimbursement for them. I want to speak specifically, you hear a lot about the cross subsidy in special education. I'd like to speak specifically to the cross subsidy in EL for English language learners. As you know, we've seen a dramatic rise in ESL participation in programming throughout our state. Lots of students and families learning English as an additional language. And one of the issues and problems that we have is that the formula for EL funding has not been adjusted in many, many years. It's not kept pace with the rate of inflation. Another issue that's out there is that one EL learner is not like another. They require different programs. And so there's no differentiation in the funding formula for the types of students. In EL, we talk a lot about SLIFE students, students with limited and interrupted formal education. And that's a student that often will come to us without literacy skills in their home language either. And so there's a different kind of need and level of support that needs to go into place for that. And we really have to remember that there's some layers of accountability that do exist in EL services as well. We have some federal accountability that's come out through the ESSER programming. And we also have in our own state plan, which states that by the year 2025, we will have 85% of our EL learners on track with progress in their English development. And so these are not areas where it's just nice to do. We're all accountable for making gains in these areas, and we really need the funding to keep pace with inflation. One option would be a really helpful piece would be to just simply tie the EL formula to the general ed formula. because then when there's an increase, that goes up as well, because there's a really huge gap in the amount of money that's being spent. And I'll just speak briefly from the metro area school districts. In the metro area school districts right now, the current rate that we are spending we're spending $129 million in the metro area to serve our EL learners, but we're only receiving about $36 million of that. I want to also just make one final point. I'm not going to get as much into special education because I think people understand the mandates that come, the legal obligations with special education. But I will remind everybody that our EL learners and our special education learners are also general ed learners. They're not separate children. They also need general ed services. And so we got to remember these are some extra supports that go into place. An area we are really focusing on in special education is cost containment. We don't want to continue to ask for more funding without figuring out better ways to do our work. Minnesota has some barriers there that probably could be addressed. One example is that we are allowed to do third-party billing for nursing services, occupational therapy. We are not for social work. We're one of the only states that isn't allowed to do that. So there are some places where there's some cost containment options there. But again, that cross-subsidy is really affecting districts in our obligation and our important responsibility for serving our EL learners as well as our students with special education needs. And so I just want to really remind everybody of that enormous crushing burden of those extra costs without the reimbursement to manage those.
Thank you so much. Up next is Jose L. Villar, and on deck is Deb Murr. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jose Villar, and I'm the statewide director of youth programs for Unidos Minnesota, a grassroots nonprofit organization that works with our Latinx community on intersecting issues of education, climate, and immigration justice. I am here today to express my support for House File 1065, in particular on the ethnic studies provisions. As a youth worker and member of the Ethnic Studies Coalition that's been working with the Department of Education and many stakeholders, I believe that investing in our schools through the implementation of ethnic studies is crucial to having a more holistic representation of our history, one that honors the upbringing and lived experiences of all our students, regardless of their race, gender, zip code, or socioeconomic status. Ethnic studies will not only bring a full representation of our history, but it will also help us address our state's achievement gaps, which according to a 2019 report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is among one of the worst in our nation. Investing in ethnic studies will not only help address that, but it will also find better means of success for our students, since research from Stanford University and San Francisco State University have proven that ethnic studies courses have boosted attendance and academic performance across all areas of discipline for K-12 and higher education. The added funds at the Department of Education for the fiscal years 2022 and 2023 will be crucial in accurately implementing ethnic studies in our schools in the state of Minnesota. And it will also give our communities clarity and a commitment from the Department of Education and the Governor's Office that we as a state must be moving towards a full representation of everyone's history. I truly believe that as a state, we can be leaders in this work and ensure that we do right by all our students, educators, and community members. Again, I urge the committee to support this bill and invest in our futures. Thank you again for the time.
Thank you very much. Members, I have asked for additional time as we still have a fairly large slate of testifiers. We will have a hard stop today at 10 minutes after 12. Up next is Deb Murr. On deck is Cheryl Polzin. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, my name is Deb Murr, and I serve as the president of the School Nurse Organization of Minnesota. We represent the licensed school nurses working in our schools across the state. We believe licensed school nurses are the bridge between health and education. We testify in support of the increase in the formula funding for our schools in the governor's bill and the $2.5 million included in the student support personnel in the appropriations beginning on line 42.25. We have a recommended language change in 42.29 that refers to a school health services specialist. We recommend one of two possible changes: either change the school health services to specialist to a licensed school nurse, or include licensed school nurse as a criteria for this important position. We are in communication with MDE with this requested change. The LSN is a registered nurse certified in public health through the Board of Nursing and certified as an LSN through the Department of Education. Although COVID has brought to the forefront the need for this position, it has always been important for equity and accessibility in public education. Did you know that 1/3 of Minnesota school districts do not have a single nurse? This leaves many students without access to healthcare at school. Did you know that the current Minnesota law only requires a licensed school nurse if there are 1,000 or more students enrolled in the district? That means whether a school has 1,000 students or 15,000 students, the district is only required to employ one licensed school nurse. This law went into effect in 1986 and was amended in 88. Thankfully, medical technology has greatly improved. As a result, many students have survived and are coming to school with significant medical needs, adding to the complexity of the support provided to students in school. I am lucky, and my kids were lucky in that we have had a licensed school nurse in all of our buildings in District 196 throughout the process. My colleague, however, serves 1,600 students at 7 different school locations. She often gets emergency calls for students related to their medical conditions, liver transplants, severe lung or heart conditions, diabetes, seizures, asthma, allergies, trachs, G-tubes, everything. All those students are thankfully in school. Often it is school administrators or clerical staff providing the medical support necessary for the child. This isn't an urban, suburban, or rural problem. It is everywhere in our state. SNOME believes going forward that a priority should be placed on securing funding for licensed school nurses in Minnesota schools. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends a professional school nurse in every school. On the surface, this sounds expensive. However, many students do not have access to health care. Licensed school nurses provide direct health care to students, meeting their health needs, teaching them self-management and independence, all while gaining their access to public education. This proactive support to students and families would reduce emergency room visits for poorly managed chronic conditions. Fearful parents would not need to propose specific health condition emergency care legislation for schools, knowing their whole child is cared for and supported at school by their nurse and school team. The health challenges for our students are many, including asthma, diabetes, allergies, seizure disorders, heart conditions, obesity, anxiety, depression, and COVID. The LSN is the professional healthcare provider in school able to support student health for access to education, building lifelong skills for independence and healthy living. And
Ms. Murr, we are at time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next is Cheryl Polson. On deck is Miss Anne-Marie Foucault. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Cheryl Polson, and I currently serve on the Wayzata School Board and on the Board of Directors for the Minnesota School Boards Association. I'm here to speak to the critical need for the legislature to stabilize public education funding in this very unpredictable time. House File 1065 is a comprehensive funding bill that we greatly appreciate. I would like to address 2 areas. Article 1, Section 9 provides basic revenue, the largest portion of a district's budget. The bill proposes to add 1% to the formula in the first year of the biennium and 2.5% in the second year. Once again, we are grateful, although we had hoped for a 2% and 2% increase, providing more consistent funding. That said, we can't lose sight of the critical point. Quality education is not achieved by underinvesting. These dollars added to the basic funding formula are critical. COVID-19 has illustrated the critical role that our school districts play in the communities we serve. Certainly now, as students are returning to our classrooms, is not the time to limit our ability to provide the best possible education services. It is unfortunate that we continue to have the same discussion we've been having for almost 20 years. While we sincerely appreciate the funding proposed in the governor's bill, sadly, it won't be enough to meet the current needs of students and to achieve the goals of closing the achievement and opportunity gaps. In Wayzata, our annual budget increases between 2% and 3% each year due purely to inflation. This is a reality for all school districts. As cited in the 2020 MDE Finance Working Group report, since fiscal year 2003, basic general education revenue has lost 10% of its buying power, or $658 per student when adjusted for inflation using CPI. With schools being asked to do more than at any time in history, asking the legislature to provide stable, predictable funding commensurate with the critical mission placed in our care is only reasonable. The second provision to discuss is Article 1, Section 11. The declining enrollment revenue category was established in fiscal year 2015 to remedy lost per pupil funding due to fewer students. It acknowledges that unstable enrollment results in reduced revenue that does not always align neatly with the district's ability to adjust personnel and other annual operating costs. COVID-19 has caused districts to experience an unforeseen and sudden enrollment decline. Districts have increased costs such as developing and implementing in-person, hybrid, and distance learning models. Social distancing requirements and operating concurrent learning models often requires increased staff. While the governor's bill directs $25 million to partially fund declining enrollment, districts need more to balance budgets that were set pre-COVID. The MSBA Board of Directors passed a resolution last December urging the legislature to calculate fiscal year 2021 district enrollment by using either the number of students on October 1st, 2019, or the number of students on October 1st, 2020, whichever is greater. The calculation more closely aligns with the funding needed and is reflected in House File 4 as well.
Ms.
In closing,
Polzin, we are at time and I apologize to have to cut you off.
That's all right. Thank you.
Up next is Ms. Foucault, and on deck is Superintendent Lewandowski. Welcome to the committee. State your name for the record, please, and please proceed.
My name is Anne Marie Fuqua, and I'm Superintendent for the St. Michael Albertville Public Schools. Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. I am speaking on behalf of Education Management Association, C, MREA, AMN, AMSD, MSBA, and MASA in favor of the equalization proposals in House File 1065, Articles 1 and 5. The governor's commitment of nearly $96 million this biennium and ongoing support into the future is the strongest statement on equalization in nearly a decade. We are very grateful to the governor for his support of this important concept and advocacy for students across the state. The governor's budget clearly points out the need for improvements in our equalization program. State aid once composed nearly 25% of district referendum and local optional revenue, but that has fallen to just under 9%. Likewise, the debt service equalization program has seen significant erosion. When first implemented in 1991, the program assumed nearly 12% of school debt service, but now the state picks up just over 2%. Directing the greatest amount of equalization toward local optional revenue aid produces the widest distribution of benefits to Minnesota school districts. Like STMA, over 100 school districts have only the 724 in local optional revenue and no additional voter-approved levies. Most equalization proposals concentrate solely on voter-approved levies, which precludes these districts from receiving any property tax relief. This proposal will provide low property wealth districts with relief whether or not they have voter-approved levy beyond their local optional revenue. The inclusion of an increase in debt service equalization is also crucial. Currently, only 23 districts with extremely high debt service qualify for debt service equalization. The governor's proposal would more than triple the number of districts that qualify for this program. Lastly, the proposal would simplify the referendum equalization program and index it to growth in statewide property wealth to make certain that the value of the equalization to taxpayers is not eroded. It would also benefit over 90% of Minnesota school districts as they would see a levy reduction. Further, it simplifies the levy system by collapsing tiers of equalization into a more straightforward and understandable system. STMA's situation is not unlike a number of low property wealth school districts. We are a growing district, and because of that, voters in the school district have had to dedicate a large portion of tax effort to building projects. Our property wealth is 37% of the statewide average, and we consistently rank at the bottom of school districts and general education revenue. The equalization increases in the governor's budget will provide greater tax fairness to property taxpayers at STMA and many other districts across the state. Thank you for your time and for the opportunity to speak on an issue that continues to be a source of unity in my community. House File 1065 truly puts students first and will help Minnesota students move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Up next is Elizabeth Rogers, who is stepping in for Superintendent Lewandowski. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed.
My name is Elizabeth Lodge Rogers, and I am the Assistant Superintendent of Intermediate District 287. Again, here on behalf of Sandy, who is unavoidably detained. Our intermediate district provides services to 11 West Metro districts. We serve some of the highest need students in the state, and I am representing all 4 of the intermediate school districts in the state of Minnesota. I really want to thank the committee for its focus on race equity, trauma, and student mental health. Our student population is 63% students of color, and many students are impacted by all 3 of your priorities. As such, nearly 300 students attend one of our 4 area learning centers. However, several parts of this proposed bill negatively impacted impact students in my school district, and I do not believe they align with the committee's focus. This includes not providing revenue for declining enrollment in intermediate districts, the administrative transfer of 0.5% of ALC funding to MDE, and in the changes to the definition of eligibility for ALC students. The ALC portions of the bill that I want to speak to today are the administrative transfer to MDE and the change in eligibility definition. The impact of the administrative transfer is significant for students in our ALCs because many in our ALC centers have attempted their local high schools or alternative schools. The proposed addition under 126C21 subdivision 6 provides for the administrative transfer of 0.5% of the general education aid we receive for each student and allocates it to MDE. This represents in our situation $117,000 for our 4 programs, which is 1.5 teachers. We also want to remind the committee that the amount of revenue for a student attending an ALC is already 10% less than comparable students in K-12 programs, as the revenues from the referendums do not flow to the intermediate district. The new language would obviously reduce our revenue further. I think this is an unintended consequence for these very high need students and merits a review. Secondly, the language proposed starting at line 30.19 eliminates almost all of the current eligibility definitions for student enrollment in an alternative learning center program.
Ms. Rogers, I apologize. We are at time.
All right.
Why don't you give us that number one more time and we can try to look at that.
Under 30.3019, the eligibility criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Members, our testifier, Samantha Diaz, had to drop off the call. There is a letter from the Latino Council that I would suggest you take a look at. And we have just a couple minutes left before we need to end. Representative Creshaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just quick closing comments. I realize this bill is going to be laid over, which what that really suggests is that this isn't going to be a serious proposal by the governor. We still have the February forecast coming out on Friday, so I suspect we'll continue to see revisions. I appreciate the fact that we have this up for a conversation, but the fact that we didn't really even get a chance to delve into questions tells me that the seriousness of this is lacking. This bill really has no provisions to reopen schools, and that bothers me that the governor continues to push that issue aside, or it suggests to me that the governor wants to continue to do this by himself and do it through executive orders. To all the education and superintendents presenting, what I didn't hear from you was a full in-depth analysis of all the mandates that are in here. There's a number of policy provisions that are not being considered even by the policy committee. So while they're out there and they're probably just conversation points, there is no seriousness in this, and I don't think this vote will ever be voted on by the House floor. So I appreciate the conversation, but just also wanted to bring light to the fact that I didn't see the seriousness to be included on this. Thank you, Madam
Thank you,
Chair.
Representative Creshaw. Representative Davney, any closing remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Wanted to thank the committee and the testifiers for their time today. House File 1065 is a clear statement on the part of the governor with a great deal of support from the House majority to support our students, families, and educators as we transition hopefully out of this pandemic and look for partners who are willing to step forward responsibly and support that reopening, returning to in-person education and supporting our educators in doing that. It also is a real look at ensuring that all Minnesota students are seen and reflected in their curriculum and are supported in their learning. That is what will position Minnesota best for the future. I look forward to working with members of this committee and the administration on moving this forward. With that, again, Madam Chair, thank you for your work today. Committee members and testifiers, thank you all. With that, I would like to renew my motion that House File 1065 be laid over for possible inclusion in a future bill. Thank you.
With that, Representative Dabney renews his motion to lay House File 1065 as amended over for possible inclusion.